The wind roared outside, whipping the trees and causing the window panes to vibrate violently. Emily McAllister watched the approaching hurricane with a racing heart, the sound of nature's fury mingling with her confused and anxious thoughts. Hurricane Milton had been announced as the most destructive in decades, and the news kept hammering on about the imminent dangers. But it wasn't just the fear of the storm that haunted her that night. There was something much deeper and more personal that she was alone in her parents' house, located in a small coastal town in Canada. Almost everyone had evacuated, but Emily decided to stay to protect the house that held all the memories of her childhood. However, deep down, she knew that this decision wasn't just about the house. There was a storm inside her, one that no weather alert could predict. As the first heavy drops began to fall, Emily sat at the kitchen table, looking at a photo of her mother, Margaret, who had passed away a year before. They had had a complicated relationship, marked by arguments, painful silences, and a distance that was never completely overcome. Even after her mother's death, Emily felt an overwhelming weight, as if something between them had been left unfinished. A solitary tear rolled down her face as she whispered to the photo, "Why did you leave before we could resolve everything?" It was a question that echoed inside her like the howl of the wind outside. The loss of her mother had left a huge void, but the real gap was in the words that were never spoken, in the apologies that were never exchanged. Margaret had always been strong but closed off in her feelings, and Emily had inherited that trait. Now the approaching storm seemed like a reflection of the emotional turmoil she had always avoided facing. The loud crack of a tree breaking outside brought her back to reality. She stood up suddenly, feeling the panic rising. The lights began to flicker, and soon after, a blackout. The sound of the storm now seemed even more frightening in the dark. Grabbing a flashlight, Emily climbed the stairs to her mother's old room. There was something about that place that drew her, something she had never been able to face head-on. At the back of the closet, hidden behind old clothes and dusty boxes, Emily found a small wooden box she had never seen before. Her hands trembled as she picked it up and carried it to the bed. Sitting there, under the deafening sound of the storm, she opened the box. Inside there were letters, many letters, all written by her mother. Some were addressed to her but had never been sent. Emily's heart raced. With trembling hands, she picked up the first letter and began to read. The words were like lightning piercing the storm of her soul. "Dear Emily, if you are reading this, I'm probably already gone. There are so many things I never knew how to say to you, so many apologies I never made because I thought time would resolve everything. But now I see that time doesn't resolve anything when we avoid what really matters. I wish I had been a better mother to you, more open, more present. I made mistakes, Emily, and it hurts me more than I can express. But what I want you to know is that amid all my mistakes, I loved you deeply. Never doubt that. Please forgive me." Emily stopped reading, the tears already falling freely. It was as if each word opened a new wound, but at the same time brought a healing she never imagined possible. All along she had believed her mother was distant by choice, that she didn't care enough. But now there in those lines written with regret and love she saw the truth. She didn't have time to process everything before a huge crash shook the house. The wind howled with terrifying intensity, and the sound of debris hitting the walls made Emily's heart leap in her chest. The hurricane was at its peak, and she knew she needed to protect herself. But before running to shelter, she grabbed the letters and held them to her chest as if they were a shield against the world's fury outside. Descending the stairs, she took refuge in the basement, where the noise of the storm seemed a bit more distant, but still terrifying. Sitting on the cold floor with the letters in her hands, Emily felt a mix of fear and hope. Outside, the hurricane was devastating everything, but inside her something was being rebuilt. There was a new strength being born, one that came from understanding, acceptance, and above all, forgiveness. She was no longer alone in that storm. Her mother's words, finally revealed, enveloped her like a warm embrace amid the chaos. And in the midst of that devastating hurricane, Emily began to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, this was the miracle she so desperately needed. The wind continued to roar outside, battering the house walls with the force of an enraged giant. Sitting in the basement, Emily felt the sound of the storm reverberate through the beams and windows, as if the world around her was collapsing. But within herself, something different was beginning to form. Among the letters from her mother that she held in her lap and the echo of destruction outside, Emily felt both vulnerable and strengthened. Her mother's words, full of regret and love, echoed in her mind. There were more letters in the box, more confessions and apologies that Margaret had written but never had the courage to share. And now, amid the chaos, Emily felt she was being led to a new understanding, an understanding she had not foreseen. With the flickering flashlight casting shadows on the walls, she opened the second letter, her heart heavy yet eager. Her mother's handwriting was firm, but the words, like in the previous letter, were filled with a pain that Emily was only beginning to understand. Emily, you may never know this, but there was always a storm inside me, one I didn't know how to control. My childhood was difficult, and the fear of failing as a mother was something that always haunted me. In you, I saw so much of myself that, at times, it terrified me. I wanted you to be strong, independent, to never need anyone. But in the process, I ended up pushing you away, and that's something I carry every day. I don't know if you'll ever be able to forgive me, but I need you to know. If I was harsh, it was because the fear of failing as a mother blinded me to what you really needed. I didn't want to hurt you, but I understand that in trying to protect you, I ended up hurting you. Emily felt a knot forming in her throat. Her mother, always so strong and distant, was in fact battling her own demons. She had always imagined that Margaret chose silence and harshness out of pride, but now she saw that it was all driven by fear, a fear of failing, of not being enough. With the letters in hand, Emily slowly stood up and approached the small basement window. Outside, the wind continued to ravage everything in its path. The tall trees surrounding the house seemed ready to collapse, and the sound of breaking branches and the roof shaking was deafening. Hurricane Milton was at its maximum fury, and she knew that the house, built by her father years ago, was at risk. But surprisingly, despite the chaos, Emily felt a new clarity. The storm she had always carried inside, the one that distanced her from her mother and made her feel lost for so long, was beginning to dissipate. Now she saw that the mother who had raised her, though imperfect, was trying in her own way to be what she thought was necessary. Margaret wasn't cold from lack of love, but from fear of showing weakness. As the hours passed and the noise of the storm remained deafening, Emily decided to read all the letters. Each one brought a new layer of understanding. Margaret spoke of the fights, the moments of silence that hurt them both, and the deep regret for never having had the courage to talk to Emily while she was still alive. One letter in particular caught Emily's attention. It was longer than the others, and seemed to have been written in her mother's last days. With trembling fingers, she began to read. "My dear daughter, I know you hate me, and I know there are good reasons for that. I was harsh, I was absent, and above all I was a mother who left much to be desired. But I need you to know that none of this was because I didn't love you. On the contrary, you were the only thing that kept me standing, even when I didn't know how to show it. I regret the arguments, the words that hurt, and as I write this, I know I may never have the chance to say it in person. The illness is taking me quickly, faster than I imagined. I wish I had more time. I wish I had the chance to fix what I broke, but I know it may already be too late. So what can I say? Only that I love you, Emily. I always have, even when it didn't seem like it. I wanted to be a better mother. I wanted to give you more. But above all, I want you to know that the love I feel for you is greater than my mistakes. I hope that someday you can forgive me. With all the love I've kept, your mother, Margaret. Emily couldn't hold back the tears. That last letter, filled with love, regret, and vulnerability, revealed a truth she had never allowed into her heart. Throughout her life, she struggled to understand her mother, fought against the silence that distanced them, without ever realizing that her mother was equally lost. Outside, the hurricane seemed to finally be losing strength. The deafening noise of the wind was diminishing, and Emily, for the first time that night, felt that the storm was passing, both the storm outside and the one within her. As the first lights of morning began to appear on the horizon, Emily realized that something deeper had been destroyed that night. Not the house or material possessions, but the invisible barriers that had kept her heart closed for so long. There was a new space now, a space for forgiveness, for healing, and for a love that, even imperfect, was true. She held the last letter to her chest and whispered, feeling the tears still flowing, "I forgive you, Mom, I forgive you." And for the first time in years, Emily felt at peace. When morning finally came, the house was enveloped in an unusual silence. Hurricane Milton had passed, leaving a visible trail of destruction, but the calm that followed was almost surreal. The wind, which had once roared with the force of an uncontrollable beast, was now just a gentle breeze shaking the fallen leaves on the soaked ground. Emily slowly climbed the basement stairs, still holding her mother's letters as if they were a talisman. When she opened the living room door, she was momentarily paralyzed. The roof had been partially torn off, and debris was scattered all over the floor. Parts of the wall were broken, and the dining room table, the place where so many silent meals had occurred with her mother, was now covered with branches and leaves brought in by the wind. She approached the broken window and looked outside. The trees around the house were down, and the road seemed completely impassable. The small garden her mother used to tend was unrecognizable, devastated by the brutal force of the hurricane. But even amidst the destruction, Emily felt an unexpected stillness within herself. It was as if, after years of internal storms, the chaos outside finally reflected what she had always felt inside. But unlike before, now there was an opportunity for Rebby. She picked up the phone, hoping to find a signal, and tried to call her brother, Ethan. They hadn't spoken in a while. Tensions with their mother had also driven them apart, and he had moved to Vancouver shortly before Margaret's death. To her surprise, the call went through. "Hello, Emily?" Ethan's voice sounded surprised and concerned at the same time. "It's me," she said, taking a deep breath. "I'm okay. The hurricane has passed, but the house has suffered a lot of damage. My God, I tried to call you several times. I was worried. I heard about Hurricane Milton and didn't know if you had evacuated." Ethan paused, the silence on the other end of the line laden with unspoken feelings. "I didn't leave. I stayed here at Mom's house," she admitted. "And Ethan, I found some letters that Mom wrote but never gave me." "Letters? What did they say?" Ethan's voice was now softer, almost vulnerable. "She wrote about us, about how she wanted to be different, about how she loved us but didn't know how to show it. I think I understand now, everything that happened between us, the distance, the arguments. She was so afraid of failing, and I think we never realized how much she was struggling with that." Another silence followed, and then Ethan sighed deeply. "I always thought she was too harsh, too distant. I never imagined there was this side of her hidden. It's hard to believe that while we were suffering in silence, she was too." "Yes," Emily agreed, her voice choked. "I forgave her, Ethan. I know it doesn't erase what happened, but I feel like now I can move forward. She tried in her own way, even if she got it wrong." Ethan was silent for a few moments, as if processing those words. Emily knew her brother carried the same hurts and resentments as she did, perhaps even more intensely, since he had chosen distance as his way of dealing with the pain. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive," Ethan finally replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I want to understand. I want to try. If you found peace with all this, maybe I can too." "We can try together," Emily responded, feeling a renewed connection with her brother, something she thought had been lost forever. Mom wanted us to be united, even if she didn't know how to say it. And somehow, I think now is our chance to do that. Ethan agreed, and they arranged to meet at the house once the roads were cleared. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt there was hope for rebuilding not just the house but the family itself. As she hung up the phone, something caught her attention. Amidst the debris near the living room, there was a small wooden chest that belonged to her mother. Emily had never known what Margaret kept there, as the chest was always locked. Now, with the storm, the lid had opened and old papers and photographs were scattered on the floor. She approached, feeling her heart race again. Among the photos, there was one that immediately caught her attention. It was an image of a young Margaret, holding 2 babies in her arms, with a radiant smile on her face. Emily recognized herself and Ethan in the photos, but what struck her most was the gentle expression on her mother's face, a look she had never seen in her while growing up. Beside the photos, there was a small notebook with notes. Emily picked it up and began to leaf through, finding short phrases, almost like a diary of thoughts. On one of the pages, Margaret had written, "I was always told that being a mother would be easy, but I never knew the real challenge would be dealing with the shadows of my own past while trying to illuminate the future of my children. I love Emily and Ethan more than anything, but sometimes I wonder if I'm capable of showing that to them in the way they deserve." Emily closed the notebook, feeling her mother's words echo deeply in her heart. There was so much she had never known about Margaret. What seemed like coldness, what seemed like distance, now revealed itself as an internal struggle Margaret had faced alone all her life. Suddenly Emily realized that, just as the storm had passed, her own wounds were beginning to heal. What once seemed like an irreparable relationship now gained new layers of understanding. There was hurt, there was pain, but above all there was love, a love that survived human failure and frailty. She looked at the blue sky now peeking through the dark clouds, and for the first time felt a deep gratitude, not just for physical survival, but for the opportunity to heal something much more important, her heart. 2 days had passed since the hurricane, and the small coastal town was beginning to reorganize. Roads were being cleared, and residents, with the help of volunteers, were working to rebuild the homes and lives devastated by the storm. The sound of chainsaws and hammers echoed through the streets as fallen trees were removed and damaged roofs began to be repaired. Emily was on the porch of her mother's house, looking at the destroyed garden, feeling the strange mix of sadness and relief that the storm had left behind. The hurricane had taken so much, but also in a way returned something she thought was lost forever. The chance to reconnect with her roots, with her own story. At that moment, she saw Ethan's car approaching down the dirt road. He got out of the car and paused for a moment, looking at the house with eyes full of almost palpable nostalgia. It was the first time he had returned to their mother's house since the funeral, and Emily knew it must be difficult for him. "It's worse than I imagined," Ethan commented, walking toward the porch. "But I'm glad you're okay." Emily smiled tenderly, recognizing the effort he was making to be there, and welcomed him with a hug. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meanings neither of them needed to verbalize. "I found a few more things," she said as they entered the house. "Old photos, Mom's notes. Every time I read something of hers, I understand more how much she was struggling with things we never knew." Ethan looked around the house, now in pieces, and sighed. "I always thought Mom didn't care enough," he confessed, picking up one of their childhood photos where Margaret held them in her arms. "But I think the truth is, we never tried to understand the burden she was carrying." "She left many things hidden," Emily agreed, sitting on the sofa covered in dust and storm debris. "But now, reading her letters, I see that she loved us deeply. She just didn't know how to show us in the way we needed." Ethan sat beside her, his eyes scanning the photos and papers spread out. There was something fragile about that moment, as if they were touching the foundations of something that had been locked away for a long time. The silence between them, once an abyss, was now a safe space where they could confront their memories and hurts without fear. I read some of these letters, Emily continued, showing him the handwritten pages of Margaret, and in all of them she talks about the fear of failing as a mother. She knew she was making mistakes, but didn't know how to fix them, and now I see that for so long I carried resentments without understanding what was really happening. Ethan picked up one of the letters and read it in silence. His expression changed as the words penetrated his emotional barriers. He wasn't one to express his feelings easily, and Emily knew that for him all this was a slow, painful process. After a few minutes, he put the letter back on the table and looked at his sister. "She never told me any of this," Ethan murmured, shaking his head. "I always thought she just gave up on us, you know. After Dad died, it was like something in her died too, and I was so angry that I couldn't see what she was facing." Emily nodded, feeling the same pain he did. Losing their father had been a hard blow for the whole family, but while she and Ethan tried to cope with the grief in different ways, Margaret seemed to have completely shut down. Now, in light of the letters, things made more sense. "I think we both carried a lot of unnecessary hurt," Emily said softly. "She made mistakes, sure, but I think now we can understand why. It's not easy, but I think we can forgive her." Ethan was silent for a few seconds, processing those words. It was evident that he was still struggling with his own feelings, but there was something different about him now. The wall of resentment he had built over the years was beginning to crack. "I'll try," he said, his voice low but firm. "I don't know if I can forgive her completely yet, but I want to try. I think it's the least she deserves." Emily smiled, feeling a wave of relief. They didn't need to resolve everything at once. The important thing was that they were finally starting to open up, to allow themselves to feel something beyond the pain and anger they had carried for so long. As the sun began to set on the horizon, casting a golden light over the debris around the house, Emily and Ethan went out to the garden. Outside, among the broken branches and destroyed flowers, there was a tree that Margaret had always tended with great care. It was a cherry tree, whose pink blossoms adorned the garden every spring. Even with the storm, the tree remained standing, still firm despite some fallen leaves and broken branches. It was a symbol of resilience, of life that endures even amid chaos. Emily approached the tree, touching its rough trunk with her fingers, and looked at Ethan. She loved this tree, she said, remembering how Margaret spent hours caring for it. "I think in a way this tree represents her, strong but also fragile, trying to survive despite everything." Ethan nodded, and the two stood there in silence for a few moments, observing what remained of that place that had so often served as a refuge for their mother. "Let's take care of this tree," Ethan said suddenly. "Let's do it for her and for us too." Emily smiled, and together they began to clean up the debris around the cherry tree. It was a simple gesture, but full of symbolism. They were, at last, rebuilding not just what the hurricane had destroyed, but also the bonds that life had undone. As night fell, Emily looked up at the sky, feeling a deep sense of relief. The hurricane had devastated many things, but it had also brought to light what needed to be faced. And now, with Ethan by her side, she knew that the path to healing, though long and full of challenges, was finally before them. In the days that followed, the coastal city began to show signs of recovery. Rescue teams worked tirelessly to restore order, remove debris, and provide shelter for the homeless. The community was united, all rebuilding their lives together, while the weight of Hurricane Milton's tragedy still hung in the air. At the McAllister family home, Emily and Ethan were slowly rebuilding what the hurricane had destroyed. The roof was being repaired, and they spent days cleaning the garden, removing branches and debris left by the storm. But the real reconstruction was not of the house. The real work was happening inside them, in the effort to heal the emotional wounds that time, silence, and distance had caused. Sitting in the garden, Emily watched the cherry tree that, despite all the damage, bravely stood. Around it, chaos and destruction were visible, but the tree remained firm, its deep roots holding it in the ground. It was a living metaphor for what she felt inside herself. The internal storm, which for so long had distanced her from her mother and brother, had been devastating. But now, amid the emotional debris, something new was emerging. "I think I've never been as at peace as I am now," said Emily, looking at Ethan, who was beside her. "It's strange, isn't it? We've been through so much chaos, so much destruction, but it seems that, amid all this, we found a kind of healing that we would never have reached otherwise." Ethan, who was crouched cleaning the last fallen leaves from the storm, looked at his sister and nodded. "You're right," he replied. "The storm brought destruction, but it also forced us to face things we've avoided for years. I think if the hurricane hadn't happened, we probably would have continued living as we were, distant, carrying the same hurts." Emily knew he was right. The hurricane had exposed not only the weaknesses of the house, but also the emotional fragilities they both carried. Just like the uprooted trees and destroyed roofs, they were forced to confront the fragile foundations of their relationship with their mother and with themselves. "I still think a lot about Mum's letters," she said, almost as a confession. "The way she wrote about the fear of failing. I spent so many years thinking she didn't care, that she was distant by choice. But now I see she was fighting her own demons, not knowing how to include us in that fight." Ethan stood up and approached, standing beside Emily as they both watched the partially destroyed garden. "It's funny how a storm can teach us so much," he commented thoughtfully. "Hurricane Milton destroyed almost everything, but it also gave us the chance to rebuild. And maybe for us, this is the opportunity to rebuild our relationship with Mum, even though she's no longer here." Emily looked at her brother and felt a wave of gratitude. He had always been more reserved, more closed off in his feelings, but now there was an openness, a vulnerability she didn't recognize in him before. And it was precisely this openness that allowed them to heal old wounds. As the two continued to clean the garden, something surprising happened. Amid the debris under broken branches and dry leaves, Emily found a small plant sprouting. She knelt, observing the tender life beginning to emerge from the devastated earth. "Look at this, Ethan," she said with a gentle smile. "Amid all this destruction, something new is growing." Ethan crouched beside her, observing the plant that seemed to have sprouted almost miraculously. It was small, fragile, but full of life. It was a silent reminder that even after the worst storms, life found a way to continue. "This seems like a symbol of what we're going through, doesn't it?" he said, almost in a whisper. "The storm destroyed a lot, but it can't stop life from moving forward." Emily smiled, feeling the weight of those words. Life, even after so much chaos, always found a way, and she and Ethan, despite all the years of hurts and resentments, were now finding their way back to each other. In the days that followed, as the house's reconstruction progressed, they began to talk more openly about their mother, about the memories they held of her, and about the letters Emily had found. Each conversation brought a new level of understanding, a new layer of healing. Ethan began to open up more about his own feelings of guilt. He admitted that after their father's death, he felt he should have taken more responsibility for the family, but instead, he distanced himself, unable to deal with the weight of the expectations he believed his mother had of him. "I think she expected a lot from us," he said one afternoon while they worked on the house's roof. "But at the same time, she never knew how to tell us that. It was like she wanted us to guess what she was feeling." Emily reflected on this. Margaret had always been a person of few words, but now, with the letters revealed, she saw that her mother had a depth of feelings she never knew how to express. There was so much love, but also so much fear, fear of failing, of not being enough, of losing her children to the world. "I think she was so afraid of losing us," Emily commented, sitting beside Ethan as the sun began to set. "And in the end, that's what drove her away from us. But now, with everything that's happened, I feel we're closer to her than ever." Ethan looked at his sister, and for the first time in years, smiled with genuine affection. "We're rebuilding, Emily," he said with a lightness she hadn't seen in him before. "And it's not just the house. We're rebuilding our story, our connection. Maybe we'll never be able to erase the wounds of the past, but we can grow from them." Emily nodded, feeling a deep peace. The hurricane had destroyed many things, but it had also revealed the truths they needed to face. And now, amid the chaos, something new and much stronger was being born. Just like the small plant sprouting among the debris, she and Ethan were blooming again. They looked at the nearly finished house and the garden where the cherry tree continued to stand. The sun set on the horizon, casting a golden light over them, and for the first time in a long time, both felt that despite everything, they were exactly where they should be. The days turned into weeks, and gradually the McAllister family house was almost completely rebuilt. Hurricane Milton had left visible scars on the city, but the strength of the community, united by shared suffering, helped everyone to rise again. For Emily and Ethan, the storm brought not only destruction but also an opportunity for a fresh start, both externally with the house and internally with their relationships and their own understanding of themselves. One morning, while organizing their mother's last belongings, Emily found a small old box she had never seen before. It was hidden on a high shelf in Margaret's bedroom closet, covered in dust, as if it had been forgotten there for many years. "Look at this," Emily said, calling Ethan to see. "I don't think we've ever seen this box before." Ethan approached, and together they opened the lid, revealing the contents. Inside there were more letters, but something different caught their attention. It was a small, sealed envelope with writing that seemed older, almost faded by time. The recipient, "For Emily and Ethan, only when you are ready." The two exchanged looks, feeling a shiver run down their spines. It seemed that even after Margaret's death, she still held secrets that were only now ready to be revealed. "Should we open it?" Ethan asked, hesitant. "I think so," Emily replied, feeling her heart race. "We've been through so much, maybe this is the last piece we need to understand everything." With trembling hands, she opened the envelope. Inside was a long letter, and as she began to read aloud, Margaret's words echoed through the room, as if her mother were there, present with them at that moment. "Dear Emily and Ethan, if you are reading this letter, it is because you are finally ready to understand a truth that I never knew how to tell while I was alive. This is the hardest part of our story, and I know it may be painful. But I also know it is something you need to know to finally find peace. There was a time before you were born when your father and I faced many difficulties. We tried to have children for years but always failed. I felt like I had failed as a woman and as a wife. The desire to be a mother consumed me, but the frustration only grew with each attempt. So in a moment of despair, we made the decision to adopt." Emily paused for a moment, feeling the impact of the words. She and Ethan exchanged a look of surprise, not knowing how to process that information. Adopted. Them. It was something they had never imagined. "Go on," Ethan urged, his voice low, visibly shaken. Emily took a deep breath and resumed reading. "You are not our biological children, but that never, not for a second, diminished the love we felt for you. When we adopted you both, I felt complete for the first time. I felt that God had given me the chance to be a mother, even in a way I had never foreseen. But at the same time, I always carried the fear that if you discovered the truth, it might create a distance between us. Your father and I decided to keep it a secret, believing we were protecting you. But as the years passed, this secret began to weigh on me. As you grew, I feared that this truth, when revealed, could drive us even further apart. I know I was wrong not to tell you sooner, and perhaps that was the biggest mistake of my life. But I want you to know that despite this secret, the love we felt for you was and always will be real. You are my children, my greatest treasures, and the greatest joy of my life was being your mother. I hope that now that you know the truth, you can forgive me for not having the courage to tell you before. With all my love, Mom." Emily finished reading, and the silence that followed was dense and heavy. Margaret's words, filled with love and regret, echoed in the air like a late but deeply necessary confession. They were adopted. A truth so big, it changed everything they thought they knew about their own stories. But at the same time, something profound began to unfold within Emily. "We were everything to her," Emily whispered, holding the letter tightly. "She didn't tell us out of fear of losing us." Ethan seemed stunned, pacing back and forth in the room, processing the revelation. "This changes so much," he said, his voice laden with emotion. "But at the same time, it changes nothing. She was our mother, always was. This doesn't make her love any less." Emily nodded, feeling tears fill her eyes. The truth was harsh, yes, but there was something liberating about it. Margaret had spent her life carrying this secret, fearing that the truth might destroy the family. But now, with the revelation, Emily understood something much deeper. The love her mother felt for her and Ethan was real, regardless of blood or genetics. It was a love that transcended fear, that endured even distance and silence. "She gave us everything," Emily said, wiping away the tears. "And now I think we can finally understand why so many things happened. She loved us so much that the fear of losing us paralyzed her." Ethan finally stopped pacing and sat beside Emily. "I know," he replied, his voice breaking, "and I think I'm ready to forgive her. I understand now that she was fighting against an enormous weight, and we never knew it." The two sat in silence for a few minutes, allowing the impact of the truth to settle within them. The pain of the discovery was still there, but along with it, there was a new understanding. They could forgive, because now they knew that all their mother's suffering and silence came from a place of love, even if imperfect. "I think now we're ready to move on," Emily said, feeling a peace she had never felt before. Ethan nodded, and together they carefully stored the letters like relics of a truth that in the end freed them. Outside, the sky was clear, with no signs of a storm. The sun shone over the newly rebuilt garden, and the cherry tree, which had withstood the hurricane, continued to stand, blooming. The days following the discovery of Margaret's letter brought deep reflection for Emily and Ethan. The revelation about their adoption had shaken their foundations, but contrary to what they feared, it brought a sense of relief, of clarity. Their mother's love, which once seemed surrounded by doubts and silences, was now understood in its fullness. Margaret had struggled, yes, but not for lack of love, rather for too much love. As the city returned to its rhythm after the hurricane, the McAllister house also rose again. With the help of friends and neighbors, the roof was completely repaired, the windows replaced, and the garden, once devastated, began to bloom again. The process of physical reconstruction was almost a mirror of the emotional healing Emily and Ethan were experiencing. That morning, as she opened the living room curtains, Emily was greeted by the soft sunlight, illuminating the room with a golden glow. For the first time in a long time, she felt that the house, full of memories and scars, was finally at peace. There was no longer a sense of loss or weight. The silence, which once suffocated her, now felt welcoming, full of promises of a new beginning. Ethan entered the room, bringing 2 cups of coffee. They sat together at the kitchen table, looking out the window at the garden where the cherry tree bloomed, its light pink canopy dancing gently in the wind. "It seems like we made it," Ethan said with a gentle smile, taking a sip of the coffee. Emily nodded, feeling grateful for every step of this journey. The hurricane had destroyed so much, but it had also opened doors they would never have dared to cross. Their relationship, once marked by distance and resentment, now flourished, just like the cherry tree outside. "I think Mom would be proud," Emily said, looking at her brother. Even with all the mistakes and secrets, she always wanted us to be together. And, in a way, I think that's what we're doing now. We're rebuilding what was broken." Ethan agreed. For years he carried the weight of silence, anger, and misunderstanding. But now everything seemed so distant, as if each emotional wound was finally healing. "I've thought a lot about the letter," he began, his eyes thoughtful. "About how Mum hid the truth from us. For so long I was angry with her because of everything, but now I understand that her fear wasn't that we weren't her children. The fear was of losing what she loved more than anything." Emily observed him, seeing that her brother, always so closed off, was finally allowing himself to feel. It was like watching ice melt, revealing the essence of who he was behind all the years of emotional protection. "Her love was what kept us here," Ethan continued. "Even when she was absent, even when she seemed distant, that love, as imperfect as it was real. And now, knowing everything, I can finally forgive her. And I think I can forgive myself too." Those words, spoken with such sincerity, brought tears to Emily's eyes. This was the moment she had longed for, not just reconciliation with her mother, but the healing that came from within, the one that freed them from the invisible chains of the past. She reached out and touched Ethan's arm affectionately. "We've done what she always wanted. We've found each other again. And I think in some way she knew that even after death this truth would set us free." Ethan's gaze softened and he smiled, an expression of relief on his face. "You know, Emily, I never would have imagined we'd go through all this, but now I see that the storm both outside and within us was what we needed to finally rebuild our family." The sun continued to shine outside, and the gentle song of birds filled the air. Emily stood up and went to the window, taking a deep breath. The fresh, invigorating breeze entered the house, bringing with it the scent of flowers beginning to bloom in the garden. The world seemed new, as if, after the devastation, everything was being reborn with more strength and life. As she looked at the clear blue sky, Emily felt a quiet presence beside her. There was no more pain, no more resentment, only the certainty that, despite all the mistakes and secrets, the love her mother had felt for them was the foundation that had kept them standing. She closed her eyes and whispered one last time, "Thank you, Mum, I finally understand." The gentle wind touched her face, as if it were a silent response, and Emily knew that somewhere Margaret was also at peace.